Welcome to the fourth video on ancient Rome and part 3 of the Roman Legion. In the last two videos, we dealt with the regal era legions as well as the early to mid-republican legions. And you will remember we talked about those fundamental changes going on during the mid-republic. We took a look at the changes in the formation as well as the vital changes to the equipment. In this video, we're going to continue looking at the changes to the mid-republican legion, and we're specifically going to look at the changes to the specialized units such as the Roman cavalry. Okay, so let's first take a look at the Roman heavy cavalry. Now, you will remember I indicated in the last video that the early Roman cavalry units were unarmored, wearing only a tunic and armed with a light spear, and if they were lucky, an oxhide shield. Later on, the cavalry in the Republican legions will improve, both in terms of armor and equipment. They started to wear more types of heavy armor, and as you can see in the image below, this reenactor is wearing chainmail. Now, more heavy armor meant you could mount more shock charges against enemy lines. And that's what's essentially going on. The heavy cavalry is becoming more offensive in its nature. Instead of protecting the wings, they could actually be used to launch attacks against the enemy. Now, members in the Roman cavalry were required to pay for their own equipment and horse, so it was a very expensive trade to begin with. Though if a cavalryman's horse died in combat, he would be refunded by the state. A typical cavalry contingent contained around 300 horses for each Roman legion. The cavalry contingent was divided into 10 squadrons of 30 men each. But even with the improvements to the heavy cavalry, the Romans still lacked light cavalry, and Hannibal during the Second Punic War would expose this weakness to the extreme. Speed became just as essential to any armor that you wore. Now, we talked about the Romans adopting much of their new equipment in the First Punic War. The Second Punic War taught Rome some other lessons: the use of mercenary troops. After several horrific defeats at the hands of Hannibal and Carthage, Rome decided to emulate many of the tactics that Hannibal, in a sense, taught them. And the main lesson they learned from Hannibal was the decisive role light cavalry could play in long-term campaigns. And so, as the Romans always did, they learned from their mistakes and decided to improve upon it. And so the main light cavalry units of the Carthaginians was the Numidian cavalry. And the Numidians went for faster movement over long distances. Their horses were literally bred from start to finish for speed and agility. Numidian horsemen rode without saddles or bridles, controlling their mounts with a simple rope around their horse's neck. Often they were naked, or as you can see in the diagram below, they wore just a simple leopard skin. And so they had no form of real bodily protection, except for a round leather shield. And their main weapon were javelins, in addition to a short sword. The Numidians were some of the finest light cavalry the world has ever seen. Due to their expert horsemanship and agility, as well as their lack of armor or any heavy weaponry, they were most suitable for harassing tactics. And they often charged in loose formation and would lob their javelins before wheeling off to escape the enemy's counterattack. This harassing tactic, while rarely decisive, could be extremely disorientating to a less mobile enemy, like the Roman heavy infantry. And amazingly, the Numidians held up very well in head-to-head confrontations against heavy cavalry. Hannibal also used the Numidian speed and agility to gather intelligence on the Romans, and this greatly enhanced Hannibal's reconnaissance and intelligence abilities during the Second Punic War. And so the Numidians gave the Romans a lot of grief. And so at the tail end of the war, the Romans hired the Numidians away from Hannibal. And what's that famous line? If you can't beat it, join it. Well, that's exactly what the Romans were doing here. They knew they didn't have time to train and equip light cavalry up to the caliber of the Numidians, so they just simply hired them away from Carthage. And for centuries thereafter, they worked for hire for the Roman army. And interestingly enough, they would play a decisive role in Rome's eventual defeat of Carthage. Now, I should also point out that the Romans also hired mercenary foot archers and slingers, and these units also would serve alongside of the Republican army. The normal weapon of the Roman archers was the composite bow, but we will talk more about these units when we get to the Second Punic War. Now, in terms of mercenary armies, there were advantages and disadvantages to utilizing these types of units. A benefit is that you do not have to train them, as they were already pros at what they did, and they were already armed with their own native equipment. And so it saved you vital time, because now you don't have to spend all of that time recruiting, raising, and training a new army. It's almost like going through a fast food drive-thru. You get the food right away. The main disadvantage is loyalty, and that is if the pay is late in coming and the war booty dries up, the mercenaries will simply go find another war. Okay, that's going to do it. I will see you guys in the next video.